Now that we have users and each user has its own list of foods, we can start working on the actual food tracking part. The first thing we're going to do is to create a day model. The main reason we're doing this is such that we have a way to group the foods we ate in a given day. You might be thinking, hey, we could have just used the created at or another regular date field and be done with it. The reason we create a separate module is because it allows us to add functionality on top of it. For example, a day might have a calorie goal or a status. Was a successful day or a bad day? Have you achieved your calorie goal or not? Having a dedicated model for representing a day will help us do that. Let's start. First things first, let's create a model and a migration. We can do that by typing the following command. PHP artisan make model and the name of the model, which is day, and adding -m will also create a migration file for this model. For starters, we'll need the following columns. Table, onsite being integer user, because this day will belong to a user, and table date, which will be the date of this day. You might be asking, why don't just use the default created at column to get the date of this day? The answer is, the date when the food was eaten might not be the same with the day when you're entering it. For example, say yesterday you forgot to add one meal. You should be able to go back and fill it in the next day. Okay, now that we have the day model, let's create the relationships between it and the user model. We'll have a belongs to on the day model. So we'll go to the day and say public function user, and this will return a belongs to relationship, and we'll have a has many relationship on the user model because the user has many days. This, and here we'll say day and make sure to import the class. Now it's time to create the endpoints we'll be using in our front-end application. We'll go with the general create, read, update, delete endpoints, and then add another one to get the foods eaten in a specific day. But first, let's run the migrations to make sure everything is okay. So I'll do PHP artisan migrate, fresh, and then add --seed to run the seed data. We get an error. It says that the session guard login must implement interface authenticable, null given. This error occurs because in the API file we forgot to check if the user exists before logging it in. So we need to add another check here. If user, then logged in. If you do this again, the migration is successful. Since we're here, let's add the route to create another day. So route post days controller run store. And we need to create the days controller, which we can do by writing PHP artisan make controller days controller. Now if we go to our files, HTTP controllers days controller, and we need to add in the store method. Here we need to create a new day for the authenticated user. We can do that by typing in date create, and then we pass in the user ID, which we can grab from the request. And the date, and we can use carbon for that. Think of carbon as being the moment in JS or date FNS. Carbon has a method called now, which grabs the current date, and we can just return this date. Okay, and now if we go to Postman and create a new request, let's do that. I don't even know how to do this. I can do it here and then save it. Post days, and we need date, or do we even need something? We need to pass in the date, because otherwise it will always be the current date. So we need this from the request. For example, these needs to be body params. And if we submit this request, we need to start the server first. And now we get a mass assignment exception. So we need to either add the user ID to the fillable property of the day model, or go with the guarded version. And unguard every column. And it works. And if we refresh the database, we have a date for the user ID of 1. Let's also create an index method for the days, and we'll have get days, and this will be index. And this should return a paginated result of the currently logged in user days. So public function index, and we can do that like this. Day where user ID is request user ID and paginate. This should work. If we change this, let's save this request and I'll name it store day. And copy this one and leave it as get to get the days, and we'll get the single day of our user. Let's also save this one. And the next API endpoint is the delete endpoint, and this time we need to pass in a day parameter, and we'll call the destroy method. Request user days, and we can do find date, find or fail date, and let's put this in a parameter day, and then we can do day delete and return a response JSON message record deleted. Okay, and let's try it out. I don't think it's date. It's actually day. And let's respect the convention we set up on the foods API endpoints and go with ID instead. So this will be ID and ID. And now we could take this ID of the day we've just created and see if we can delete that. With the same endpoint with one here and send, and we deleted the day. Okay. Now it would be great if we can finally add some foods to a day. To do that, we'll need an intermediate model that will connect the two other models, the day and the food model. If we think about the relationship between a food and a day, a food can belong to many different days. I can eat an apple today, tomorrow, and the other day after tomorrow. On the other side, I can eat many different foods in a single day, so day model can belong to many different food models. On top of all that, we also need a place to store the quantity of the food I just ate. So let's create the intermediate model. PHP artisan make model DayFood, and we'll need a migration for that. So we'll add in -m. Go to DayFood table. We'll need to add in the day ID, the food ID, and then decimal quantity, and we'll also store the unit of measure. The reason we do this is that a food item might change its unit of measure over time. So if one day I decide I use grams to store the nutritional information for an apple, and the next day I change my mind to use pieces, the history of my tracked days will be affected. So we'll need some duplication here in order to preserve an accurate information. And we'll also do the same for the nutritional information. So we'll do decimal for carbs, fats, proteins, and even calories, although you can easily derive those from the macronutrients. And I think that's it. The next step is to actually create the relationships between the day and the foods. So to the day model and do public function foods and return this belongs to many food class. And we'll do the same for the food model. We'll go, this food can belong to many different days, and save it. Now let's create an API endpoint that will allow us to store a food in a given day. So we'll do route post DayFood, DayFood's controller, and store method. And we need to create a controller. And the store method. Here we need to create a DayFood. And this DayFood needs to be imported and needs to have a day ID the food ID, and all the other columns, which are these. So quantity, carbs, fats, proteins. Okay. Now here is a question of personal preference. You can either choose to pass in all the parameters to the request, like quantity, unit of measure, carbs, fats, proteins, calories, meaning that these values will be calculated on the front end and passed to the back end. Or you can query the database for the specific food and grab the unit of measure from there, and also its nutritional information, and calculate each individual value. Basically, we can leave it like this, and we should be able to create a DayFood. This one is let's save this one, delete day. But we'll need to create a day first, so we'll do this. Oh, we need to open up the server. So we have food with an ID of 2. And here if we do DayFoods, actually let's create another one. This is the post request DayFoods, and we need to pass in the ID. The ID, which is 2, we've just created the food ID, which is 1, and then quantity, which is, let's say 100, which is grams, carbs 10, so and if we send these, we get an error, not found. API DayFoods, send another time. Okay, mass assignment exception. Okay, we can't fix this. DayFood can do protected, guarded, empty array. Try again. Base table. DayFood does not exist. Okay. Is it DayFood? Let's do this. DayFoods. Give it another go. And of course we need to migrate it. And the same issue occurs as we have on the food. Food is the kind of word that the plural form is the same with the singular form. So we need to specify the exact table, and of course run the migrations. And if we try again, this record was successfully created, although it should have failed. The reason for this is because the ID with 2 doesn't exist, because I just reran the database migrations. So we have no days here, but this one thinks we do. We can validate against that using Laravel's validation mechanisms. If we go to DayFood's controller, we can validate the request first. And we can say food ID is required and needs to exist in the foods table under the ID column. Same for the day ID. And this should now fail. Although it didn't. I think we need to manually validate that. Does it exist? No, it exists. Why do I get redirected? I mean, it should redirect. Oh, the reason why we get redirected is because the headers. We need to tell Laravel that we expect a JSON response. We can do this, and now we get the correct response. Selected food is invalid, although it is. Let's see, what food am I sending? 1. There is a food with an ID of 1. No, there is not. Okay, let's check the seeders. I should have. Oh, I haven't included the seed option. So now if we refresh, we have 2 foods and 0 days. This should still fail because I'm specifying the day with an ID of 2, which doesn't exist. So we'll have to create a day first. And I'll have an ID of 1, which I need to pass here, and then this will be successful. That's it for now. See you next time.